Wait, what? Holy cow, I can't believe that worked. Throughout 2024, there have been many rumors as to why Black Myth Wukong hasn't made its way over to the series consoles just yet. Some have claimed that Sony money-hatted some under-the-table deal to keep it off of the platform. Others have blamed the Series S for its memory limitations. Everyone loves to clown on the lowly potato, right? Even Paul Tassi, a reporter with Forbes covering video gaming news, has reported the following statement from Microsoft. However, during an interview this past week, the director for Black Myth Wukong said this little nugget, suggesting that the Series S's memory pool was to blame. Of course, many online have taken this quote and run with it, stirring up the typical console war discourse, but that's not why I'm here today. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. I hope you enjoy what's coming. I talk about all things tech, especially the ones that drive my passion, gaming. Regarding the current discourse, I'm not interested in PlayStation or Xbox. I'm interested in validating the developer's claims. And of course, proving fanboys wrong is always a feather in my cap. So for this video, I wanted to prove there is no memory limitation with Black Myth Wukong and debunk the optimization nonsense being talked about. Now, we've got some strict guidelines, so let's get to it. Now, the Series S console is no stranger to the channel, but for our discussion today, we're really only focusing on the memory subsystem. According to some articles online, the console has a 2 plus 8 GB memory configuration. There's 2 GB of slower memory dedicated to the operating system and 8 GB of faster memory dedicated to the video game. From there, it's kind of nebulous how much of this pool is accessible to the game directly, and if there's any other sectioning off of memory for specific uses. So for this video, we have to stick within the Series S's memory constraints while getting the game, hopefully, to just run. I've got the perfect machine in mind for this. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Turkbox Series S. This build debuted here on the channel in my Hardware Dev Makes a Better Xbox Series S video. The goal was to take the limitations of the Series S and make a more palatable solution. Ultimately, it has ended up with a Ryzen 5 3600, 16 GB of DDR4 3600 RAM, a 512 GB NVMe drive, and an RTX A2000 GPU. Now, to be fully transparent, this rig is faster than the Series S graphically, but the entire point of this video is not how good it runs, but does it run Black Myth Wukong at all? With this platform, we can monitor both the system memory and video memory usage throughout the game and see if the combined memory usage for the system is below the 8 GB dedicated to the game. First, let's run the standalone benchmark just to see if we're in the right ballpark. After turning all the dials to low, that's all the graphical settings, even the resolution, but I do want to keep frame generation on. And sure enough, it runs. Throughout the entire benchmark, we're running anywhere between 4.7 GB for system RAM and 2.8 GB of VRAM. In total, that's roughly 7.5 GB of RAM. At a 25% resolution scale, or 360p, I'm surprised just how fast this little system can run, averaging around 119 FPS over the benchmark. Bumping up FSR to quality mode, or 67%, we're still hitting 3 GB of VRAM and 4.5 GB of system RAM. This makes sense. Increasing the resolution will consume more VRAM. Regardless, we're still sitting at 7.6 gigs of total system memory. If we want to go up to a 100% resolution scale, or native res, we hit the 8 GB system threshold, running at an average of 48 FPS. So overall, we're right on that playable boundary. So I'd take that as a win. However, over on Twitter, it's claimed that running the benchmark doesn't really apply to the game. Now, I really don't like this type of game. I didn't really enjoy Elden Ring, but in the name of science, let's go ahead and buy the game. Psst, don't tell my wife. Okay, let's plop in similar settings. 50% resolution scale, no frame gen for now, low settings across the board, just like a proper Series S game. Wait, what's going on here? Our VRAM looks good, running around 3721 megabytes, similar to our benchmark, but holy cow, that's system RAM. Right now, we're already consuming 7.7 gigabytes of RAM just for the application. However, if we look over at the Windows Task Manager, we see 6.5 gigabytes of our RAM. That's way too high. What can be going on here? Now, hear me out for a second. What happens if we go from 16 gigabytes down to 8 gigabytes? I've got two 4 gigabyte sticks and they can run the same transfer rates and timings, so it should be a drop-in experiment. Now that is more like it. When there's less memory available to the system, the OS has to manage the resources better. As such, Wukong now only uses a comfortable 2 gigabytes of RAM. Our VRAM remains unchanged, so we're sitting at 5.4 gigabytes of total system RAM. This lines up perfectly with the observations that I've posted on Twitter. Even if we want to be generous on this clip, that's roughly 2.6 gigabytes of system and 3.8 video memory, or 6.4 gigabytes. Now, speaking of Twitter, it doesn't stop here, folks. Now, I know some of you guys aren't really into all the Twitter drama, so jump to the timecode down below to get yourself the TLDR. However, I've got a lot of clips coming up that prove the point even more. So let's get to the posts. I've been posting these clips on Twitter over the weekend and have gotten some rather interesting posts from several users. The most prominent is from a user, Nib95. If you've watched any of my latest content, he's another fellow PlayStation fan who thinks the PS5 Pro is equivalent to an RTX 4070. And well, we all know how that ended up. He claimed that
there's tests online that show even at 720p lowest settings, it can still hit 13 GB plus, which is well above the Series SS usable pool.
From that point, guys, I caught him hook, line, and sinker. Buckle up, folks. It's going to be a wild ride. From there, many of his fans have echoed his sentiment, claiming the desert and the snow areas are considerably larger and more open. Or you get more moves later that can allow you to clone yourself to have 7 of you fighting. And even our friend Xvault chimed in with this gem.
Glad you continue to hold this grifter accountable. I had to block him myself out of his sheer stupidity and also spinning his narrative in false avenues he takes.
Like I said, we are right on target. Next, Nip thinks that I'm
inept enough to assume a flyover benchmark is indicative of the maximum amount of RAM you might use throughout the entire game, proving you yourself don't have a clue how this works. Not to mention, like a fanboy zealot, you're suggesting the game's director is lying or that you know more than he does. You continually embarrass yourself.
At this point, it's time to take some body shots. No, Kevin Futura, I'm not farming for engagement here. I'm proving the lower-end hardware can run the game. I went ahead and posted a clip running and fighting in the first area with 2.3 gigabytes of system RAM and 4 gigabytes of VRAM. According to Nib, this is impossible. And the response, perfection.
Surely, you must understand that memory usage can differ greatly depending on the scene, gameplay, assets, environment, etc. Even when you're facing multiple enemies or major bosses in a highly taxing scene, and so on.
Now, I gave Nib the chance to explain the 10 gigabyte delta between his test case and mine, but he wouldn't bite. Instead, he just continues to pivot. Now, more body shots. In the next clip, I decided to make the game a bit more enjoyable for myself, so I increased the textures and shadows up to medium, I turned on frame gen, and I set FSR to performance mode. In the clip, I'm only using about 2 gigabytes of system RAM and 4.5 gigabytes of VRAM. The VRAM increase was as expected, and we still maintained a 1.5 gigabyte buffer of the 8 gigabyte system allocation. I even went the extra mile to add 10 enemies into the mix. As Nib himself said, memory usage can differ greatly depending on the scene, gameplay, assets, environment, etc., right? His response just shows he doesn't know what the heck he's talking about. So let's learn from his ignorance. Now, we'll look past his inability to do basic math on adding the relevant memory fields here, but let's highlight some of those personal attacks some more.
Anyone with even a modicum of common sense and intellect would know that there could be far more RAM-intensive scenes in such a comprehensive game with far larger environments and scaling enemies, bosses, abilities, etc.
In short, Nib's stance is, nuh-uh, this isn't the exact area. So let's go for the knockout. Let's go to the exact scene, the same area that he presented first, the white-clad noble fight. Thanks to my friend Bing over on X, he was able to guide me exactly where I needed to go. I'm still using about 7 gigabytes of total system memory here, and some observations are starting to boil up that I could see, and we'll get around to that shortly. And this is where Nib finally shows his hand. He just doesn't understand how the memory works. Up to this point, we've been talking about in-use memory for both the system RAM and GPU RAM. Within the OS, applications are allowed to request and can be allocated more space that just doesn't exist. This is thanks to the concept of virtual memory. Modern operating systems will track what an application is requesting, what it has allocated to the application, and where that memory exists. When we run out of physical RAM chips, the system makes virtual RAM available through the swap file. Now, I don't want to get into the technical nuts and bolts with you guys, but this is the exact scenario we have going on. The game is requesting even more RAM than it needs. The operating system isn't giving it all, and it only has access to about 7 gigabytes of RAM. This is the precise reason we saw absurd memory values before we swapped our memory sticks from the original 16 gigabyte setup. This space isn't really needed, and it doesn't have to be used. This memory technique is a common practice, and especially in this instance, it isn't relevant. As we clearly see in the clips, we are barely even hitting the swap file on the NVMe drive. The same applies to the GPU. The A2000 requests roughly 5 gigabytes of space, but the game is only using about 4 gigabytes. And more importantly, the game's performance isn't impacted. It's just humming right along. At this point, I've committed and we're going to be testing more areas, but Nib triples down with the classic backpedaling.
This scene is also far from the most demanding in the game.
He also mentions a move in the game called Pluck of Many. We'll get back to that one. I then moved on to Chapter 2, the desert area that people have been claiming is super heavy because it's an open world. Well, guys, it's not. It still only uses about 7 gigabytes for both the system and the video memory. Nib then tries to counter, but has a huge whiff, again showing his lack of understanding of how memory systems work. I asked him to explain the 23 gigabytes of allocated memory system-wide, considering this system only has 8 gigabytes, but there was no response. And time for the final blow, the closing fight in Chapter 2, the Yellow Wind Sage. This fight has all of the bells and whistles. We've got particle effects, alpha effects, sand deformation, and that dreaded Pluck of Many move that makes all these different copies of your character. Now, I'll post the tweet showing my results, but the last bullet is the most damning for Nib. At the near end of the battle, the game's memory usage dropped from 2400 megabytes to 1700 megabytes, with zero impact on performance in the fight. I only noticed it as I was rewatching the clip. That same drop happens with all the tornadoes, the multiple copies of my character, and all the other effects turned on. The game and the operating system just said, Wukong doesn't really need this much RAM, guys. Let's release it. And the game just said, okay, boss. At this point, Nib is out of ideas, and he defers to the devs to answer all of my questions. Rather than admit he's wrong, he continues pivoting and moving on to other threads, calling me disingenuous and other nonsense. Breaking news, while finishing this script, I thought I could try and see if Black Myth Wukong could even run with only 4 gigabytes of RAM while running Windows. Remember, 4 gigabytes is the minimum spec for Windows, so we are definitely pushing the limit. Not only that, but 16 gigabytes is the minimum spec for the game on PC, so this is the worst case setup that the game could come across. And wouldn't you know, holy cow guys, this runs. Yes, it's not good, but with Windows hogging over 2.5 gigabytes of RAM, Wukong is struggling to keep up with the requirements. This makes complete sense. Throughout all the clips we've seen today, we've seen the game comfortably run with as little memory as 1.7 gigabytes to it. So all the skips, the page file lurches, etc., this all makes sense. Unfortunately for Nib's followers, they totally took the bait and they just don't get it. But that's a debate for another day. So, what have we learned so far? First, with our limited memory setup, we can make it all the way into Chapter 3 of Wukong, encountering 0 memory issues. Sure, we do have to dial settings down to work within our GPU's capability, but that's a GPU thing, not memory. Second, we've tested various talking points spewed out by fanboys online. We've debunked Nib's 13 gigabyte scenario with the white-clad noble. We've debunked the desert chapter's open world, as well as the snow, which isn't extremely heavy on the RAM. More importantly, we caught the game and operating system red-handed, removing RAM from the game while in the middle of an intense boss fight, with all the graphical effects and the copy spell as directed by the users, with no impact on the game performance. I'm going to keep playing the game to see if I can hit any other instances, but this video ultimately poses a serious question. Now, I don't care about the exclusivity deals or console war stuff, but what the developers have said. Why are the developers standing behind the optimization excuse? All of the options that I've looked at today are available on PC to get the game to work. I don't even have to go to any funny business with additional mods, page file manipulation, or any of that other PC Master Race stuff. It just works, guys. The devs made specific design choices with the base game, and they went ahead and delivered a PS5 Pro patched with enhanced options. Clearly, they know how to adjust the settings, so why can't they just turn them down? We all know the Series S is a potato. It doesn't have much GPU power, but it wasn't designed to deliver a flagship experience. That's why they made the Series X. Regardless, plenty of top-tier first and third-party games run well enough on the Series S. And at the end of the day, I've accomplished what I wanted to do, and I hope you've learned more about the nuances of memory management and how it can work with lower-end hardware. If you liked what you saw, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. It will definitely help me out. Now that we're into 2025, there are plenty of other console war talking points to debunk, and I've got a PC build that I think you guys won't want to miss. So thank you guys for sticking to the end of the video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Later.